The first step in completing your waistband is to put your two waistband pieces right sides together and sew along the two short edges. If you're using a woven fabric that frays, you will want to finish that seam allowance with a serger or a zigzag stitch. Next, you will fold the bottom raw edge of your waistband up, wrong sides together, and press. For the size I'm sewing, I am going to be folding that 3/4 inches. You can check your tutorial for how much you should do. If you decide to do a rolled hem, you will do it now. If you decide to leave that ruffle edge raw, if you're using knit fabric, you can do that as well. But for both the rolled hem and the raw edge ruffle, you need to cut off that amount that you would have folded up. So for this one, I would have cut off 3/4 inches since I need to fold this up 3/4 inches. Once you press it all the way around, do not sew. Once you've folded and pressed your ruffle edge up, you will take your entire waistband piece and turn it upside down. It's still wrong side out at this point, but your folded over ruffle is now on top. If you decided to do the raw edge for a knit ruffle or a rolled hem, you will still do the same thing of following all these steps, but instead of having this fabric folded here, it would just be a rolled hem or cut raw here. Next, take your folded edge at the top and bring it down so that you're folding your waistband wrong sides together, matching the folded edge with the bottom raw edge. You'll do that all the way around and press. Now that it's pressed, the folded edge of the ruffle is in line with the raw edge of the lining side of the waistband. They are exactly flush with each other. If you did the raw knit ruffle, or if you did a rolled hem ruffle, the edge of your fabric on the main side will be in line with the raw edge of the fabric on your lining side. The waistband is now right side out and pressed. From here on out, even though it's all one fabric and not a separate main and lining piece, we will refer to the outside of the waistband as the main and the inside that will be touching the wearer's body as the lining. Next, we'll start making all of our lines that will mark where we're going to put our casings. A reminder that your folded ruffle is not sewn. It is just pressed and tucked up in there for now. You're going to find the center back of your waistband and mark. I put a clip there. The back refers to the part of the waistband that will be at the wearer's back versus the front that will be at the front of their body. We are going to make all these lines at the back of the waistband. At the point where you marked the center of the back of the waistband, draw a vertical line directly from the top to the bottom on the main side of your fabric. Next, you will draw 3 horizontal lines 2 inches long, centered over the vertical line you made marking your center back of your waistband. The spacing to put these is in the tutorial and will be different depending on the size range you are sewing. Refer to the tutorial with how far apart to make these lines. The lowest line, line 3, will be slightly below the raw edge of the folded ruffle. This is what will catch that ruffle and sew it in place. When you sew line 3, that will anchor your folded edge here in place. You do not sew that folded ruffle edge separately. If you are doing the decorative drawstring, you are now going to turn the waistband over so that you're working with the front. You can see here, these are those casing lines I made on the back of my waistband, the wearer's back. Now I'm working with the side of the waistband that will be the wearer's front. Open up your waistband and on the wrong side of your waistband, draw a vertical line marking the center front of the waistband. You can see that it extends all the way down to where my folded up ruffle edge is. Then measure down from the center horizontal crease from where your waistband is folded in half and draw a line horizontally there. The spacing between this line and your center fold line will be in the tutorial and will be different depending on the size you are sewing. Then you will apply your fusible interfacing piece below this line. that is where the buttonholes will be sewn, so that is where you will want your interfacing. Still working with the front of your waistband, after you have folded it back down, you will repeat the steps we did on the back waistband for marking where your casings will be, and you will do those same steps on the front of the waistband. Then you will additionally make 2 dots marking where your buttonholes will go. The measurements for the lines and the dots will be found in your tutorial. Once you've gotten this far, you will sew your buttonholes. It's important that your buttonholes are fully in between lines 1 and line 2 on your waistband, so that when you sew your casings, your buttonholes are fully within the bounds of this space. Now, if you did the decorative drawstring, your buttonholes are done, and if you didn't, this is where you will pick back up. You are going to sew your casings now using the measurements from these 3 lines. You will start your stitching line at the end of the first horizontal line, stitch all the way around the waistband, and when you get back to this line, you will stop here. The space that is marked with the line needs to remain unsewn. Backstitch at the beginning and end of your sewing. Repeat that step for line 2 and line 3. When you sew line 3, that is what will sew that folded up ruffle edge down and anchor that raw edge. You do not need to sew your ruffle separately. Line 3 of your casings is what will sew your ruffle edge. In sewing your casings, the seam allowance from the top or bottom edge will be listed in your tutorial for each line to help you. But if you would like, you can also continue these lines all the way around your waistband to make it easier to stay on your seam allowance. If you do, just make sure you make a mark where the stop and start needs to be, so that you make sure this space here is left unsewn when you do your casings. Having an accurate seam allowance at this step makes a very big difference to how your elastic will go through and making sure that your ruffle edge is fully caught in the sewing. Once you've sewn those 3 casing lines, you should have a gap about 2 inches wide down the back of your waistband where nothing is sewn. From the main side of your waistband, once you have these casing lines done, if you lift up your ruffle fold away from the lining side of your waistband, you'll see that the folded up raw edge of that ruffle is completely encased within the seam line for line 3 here. You don't need to hem this ruffle separately, because line 3 of your elastic casing is what sews it down and encloses that raw edge. Next, we will start attaching the waistband and the skirt. Follow the instructions in your tutorial for sewing the 2 skirt pieces together and hemming your skirt. Starting at the back of your waistband and working from the main side of your waistband, lift the bottom edge of your ruffle up and away from the lining side of your waistband. You will be folding it up right at your line 3 casing. So you will take your ruffle and separate it from the lining side. Like that. You're just folding the ruffle up right at line 3 at that seam line. Press really well all the way around your waistband so that the ruffle is up away from this bottom raw edge of the lining side of your waistband. If you used heat erasable pen for these lines at the back, don't press there, just use your fingers so that you don't erase those lines. With your ruffle pressed up away from the lining side of your waistband, turn your entire waistband upside down. Keep it right side out, but now you have the top edge at the bottom and the folded up ruffle and raw lining edge at the top. Turn your skirt wrong side out. With your skirt wrong side out and your waistband right side out but upside down, place your waistband inside your skirt. Your waistband is upside down and right side out. Your skirt is wrong side out. The waistband has been inserted into the skirt. The ruffle is folded away from the lining side raw edge from when we pressed it, so that it is away from the top raw edge of the skirt. The top raw edge of the skirt will be aligned with the lining side raw edge of the waistband. At one side seam, pin them together. So you can see here, this is the ruffle folded away from the raw edge of the lining side of the waistband. And I will take the skirt side seam, line it up with the waistband side seam, and place a clip here. I'm only clipping the skirt to this lining side of the waistband because my ruffle is up and out of the way. Pin or clip the waistband to the skirt at each side seam. You can see that the skirt is pinned or clipped only to the lining side of the waistband at the bottom edge because the main side is the ruffle and that is folded up out of the way. We only want to sew our skirt to this lining edge of the waistband. We do not want to sew our skirt to the ruffle at all. After you have pinned or clipped each side seam, continue to pin or clip all the way around the top of the skirt, anchoring the waistband to the skirt on that lining side of the waistband at the top of the skirt. At the back of your waistband, where you left that gap with no lines for your casings, you will still go ahead and stitch your skirt to your waistband there. You just want to make sure that you're aware of where that line 3 would be and just continue in a straight line so that later when you sew the gap between the two ends of line 3 closed, your skirt seam isn't in the way. So follow the same line that you're sewing directly below line 3 as you cross through this section here. After you finish clipping all the way around your skirt, you're going to sew the waistband to the skirt. You're going to use a straight stitch, even if you are working with knit fabric. If you're working with knit fabric, I suggest a longer stitch length than normal, but you can still do a straight stitch. I also recommend using a zipper foot if you have one, because you want to get as close as possible to your line 3 seam line. And if your ruffle is at all bulky, that can help. Sew your waistband to your skirt with your waistband facing up so that you can really see the line 3 seam line. Where you stitched line 3, you want to sew your skirt and waistband together with a seam allowance as close to that line as you can possibly get without crossing over it. The bigger of a seam allowance you have here, the easier it will be to attach your bodice if you are doing a dress. So as you are sewing, make sure that you are getting as close to this line 3 as you can get without actually crossing over onto that line. You may, as you sew, need to occasionally lift up the waistband from this side and make sure that ruffle piece is pulled fully away from your stitch line because you don't want to sew that ruffle. If you're using a knit fabric that doesn't fray, you can just leave that edge raw. After you finish sewing your skirt to your waistband, you can finish your seam allowance edge with a serger or zigzag stitch if you're using fabric that frays, but it is very important not to remove any seam allowance at all when you do this. Turn your skirt right side out and take the ruffle that had been folded up and press it back down. Now you're ready to put in your elastics. The first piece of elastic is going to go in the casing between the top fold of the waistband and line 1. Between here and here. With your elastic attached to a safety pin or bodkin, put the elastic through the openings that you did not sew shut all the way up into casing number 1. Work that bodkin or safety pin with the elastic all the way the entire waistband and then bring it back down out through the opening. As you thread your elastic through the casing, make sure you leave several inches out on the other side. I always put a clip on the end just to make sure there's a barrier if somehow it ends up going inside. Continue working that all the way around until you can bring it out the other end. Once you brought the elastic all the way back out through the casing, overlap the two ends 3/8 of an inch and sew back and forth over the elastic several times to secure. With the elastic now fully inside that casing, distribute your gathers towards the front of the skirt for this step. It just makes it a little easier. Now you're going to go ahead and close up the rest of that line one. So you will sew cross here, closing that line one gap. Then you can also close line two. Now the top casing has elastic in it. The second casing is empty on the front. That's the one that your buttonholes are on, but this one is empty. And now you're going to repeat with your second piece of elastic going into your third casing, which is in between the stitched lines 2 and 3. So insert your elastic the same way and then sew that third line shut the rest of the way. After you finish sewing that last line shut, redistribute your gathers evenly around the entire waistband. At this point, if you did the folded over ruffle, it might have gotten fairly flat, especially if your fabric is thicker. If you want your ruffle to be a little more three-dimensional, what you can do is just run your finger under the ruffle and fluff it up away from the skirt a bit as you go, and you can give it some dimension that way. If you chose the drawstring option, this is where you would insert your drawstring. You would have a buttonhole here and here, and you would take your drawstring cord and thread it down into a buttonhole and up back out of the other buttonhole. It does not go all the way around the waistband. It just goes into one, straight out the other one, and ties in a little bow after being tacked down in the center as per the tutorial. If you're sewing separates, the skirt is done. If you're sewing a dress, this is where you'll attach the bodice to the skirt. For sewing the dress, turn the skirt wrong side out. Then take your waistband and tuck it down into the skirt towards the right side of the skirt. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky, but just lay your skirt down and then go around your skirt, pinching the seam allowance that is the skirt and waistband seam allowance where those two were sewn together. Pinch that with one hand, hold your skirt with the other hand, and gently tug them apart. Just go around your entire skirt doing this so that you have that seam allowance tugged up, away from the skirt and away from the waistband. When you've gone around the entire skirt, the whole skirt should look like this from the outside and this from the inside. So you want that seam allowance up away from the waistband and the skirt. When you sew your bodice to the skirt, you will be sewing it to the seam allowance itself. You will not be sewing your bodice to the skirt or to the waistband where the casings are. Your bodice will only be attached to the seam allowance where the skirt and waistband attach to each other. That seam allowance will need to be gathered. You can't stretch it flat because the bodice is smaller than that, and you don't really want to be stretching your bodice as you sew. So you do want to be sure that your seam allowance is gathered. If you've sewed a gathered skirt to a bodice before, you can think of it like that, but the gathers are in the seam allowance. So rather than stretching out your seam allowance like this, leave it gathered and make sure that it is evenly gathered around the entire skirt. Place a pin or clip on that seam allowance at the two side seams and at the center front and center back of the waistband skirt. At the center front, if you did the buttonholes and drawstrings, make sure that your marking for the center front of the waistband is centered evenly between the two buttonholes. With your skirt wrong side out and your bodice right side out, and the front and back center of the bottom hem of your shirt marked, insert your bodice down into your skirt, right sides together. So your waistband is tucked into the skirt and the quarter points are marked. You'll put your bodice with the neckband first down into the skirt. Make sure it's front of the bodice to the front of the skirt. The right side of the bodice is touching the right side of the skirt, and the hem of the bodice is lined up with the seam allowance that you marked from where the waistband and skirt were sewed together. Pin the side seam of the bodice to the side seam of the skirt and waistband seam allowance. on each side. Then repeat with the front and back center. Once you have the quarter points pinned, you will fill in with pins or clips around the hem of the bodice until it is fully pinned or clipped to the skirt. Again, you are only attaching the bodice to the seam allowance where the skirt and waistband were sewed together. You can see the seam allowance where you are clipping to your bodice is gathered. You want that to be gathered. When the garment is worn and the small amount of stretch that will happen for the ease of the bodice happens and it stretches out, the gathered seam allowance is going to stretch along with the elastic because you are sewing with a stretch stitch that will allow that to happen. You do want to make sure that you are not stretching out the bodice or significantly stretching the elastic as you sew. You want your bodice to lay flush and you will adjust the gather. So right here, you can see there's more fabric on the seam allowance than there is on the bodice between these two clips. That's fine. We're going to sew right over the gathers of the seam allowance. When you sew this, sew with a zigzag stitch on your sewing machine for the best results. I do not recommend using a serger for this step. As you sew, you may need to continue to adjust the gathers and adjust the skirt. I prefer to sew this part with my skirt facing up so I can keep tugging the seam allowance away from the skirt like this as I sew, because that way it gets the seam allowance easier to sew and you know you are keeping your elastic out of the way. You want to sew right here in the middle of that seam allowance. Again, a zigzag stitch on the sewing machine is going to give you the best results. I'm sewing with the skirt facing up, and as I sew, I will sew directly over those gathers with a long zigzag stitch. You can see I don't need to stretch out my gathers to sew. I'll sew right over those gathers. I've sewn this with a wide, long zigzag stitch directly over my gathers. That way the bodice can stay flush. If you want to finish this seam allowance here now, you may, but I don't because I already finished my skirt and waistband seam allowance during the construction of the skirt and waistband, and because the bodice is knit and will not fray, I don't finish that seam allowance. You can see that with that wide zigzag stitch, sewing directly over the gathers works just fine because it allows it to sit all the way with the elastic relaxed, but when it stretches on the body, the bodice will be able to stretch for the wearer, but so will the skirt. With that nice zigzag stitch on that seam allowance, the elastic of the waistband can still stretch very nicely, but it's going to be a lot easier to sew that. You're going to do that with that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Right side out and adjust the ruffle as needed. Now optionally, you can tack your waistband to the bodice. Because the bodice is sewn down to the bottom of the waistband, because that's what gives this the look of a shirt tucked into a skirt, even though it's a dress, the waistband is open over the bodice, which is fine, but you may like to have it a little more secure. If you do, put your dress on its side and make sure that you have the side seam of your skirt and waistband and the side seam of your bodice nicely lined up. And then what you can do is just tack that down by doing a stitch in the ditch, which means to sew directly into a side seam. So you will not extend that sewing up onto the bodice. You would only sew the waistband itself. But what you'll do is, being careful not to sew through both sides of the bodice or skirt, you'll find your side seam of your waistband, pull some of your gathers away from it so it's flatter so that you can see it. The side seam is right here. What you can do is, with a coordinating thread, you can stitch a straight line directly into this seam through both the waistband and the side seam of your bodice right here. Doing that will just anchor the waistband to the skirt on each side since it is fully open. However, you don't need to do that. That's completely optional. And your cedar dress is done.